Well, first of all, in the fossil record, we go from no fossils, virtually no visible fossils. We might have microscopic fossils in so-called Precambrian rocks. But we go immediately into the Cambrian, where we have an explosion of fossils. In fact, all the body plans, we call them phyla, are represented as fossils in the Cambrian rocks. In technical terms, it's called the Cambrian Explosion. And among those fossils are the trilobites. And we find them in the rock record for a few layers up, and then they become extinct. They disappear. And then we find dinosaurs higher up. Dinosaurs were land dwellers, but the trilobites were ocean floor dwellers. Now, that tells us something. The normal idea is that, life evolved over millions of years. You put the fossils in that order of evolution. But when I'm looking at it as the order of burial during the flood. And to me, it makes more sense that you would start with marine creatures first, because we're told the fountains of the great deep broke open. It was the ocean floor that split. And so the ocean floor creatures were the first ones that would be affected. And if they didn't escape or somehow survive, they would be exterminated during the flood. Marine creatures weren't taken on board the ark, so there were no trilobites on the ark. So the trilobites live on the ocean floor. Unless they had a means of escaping, well, they obviously didn't. They perished during the flood, and as far as we know, we don't find them on Earth today. Dinosaurs, however, were land-dwelling creatures. We would expect as the floodwaters rose, they would eventually conquer the land and therefore eventually wipe out the land-dwelling creatures. But dinosaurs were part of the creatures that went on board the ark. All the land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures went on the ark, so there would have been two of every kind of dinosaur that went on the ark. They would have been young dinosaurs, not the huge old dinosaurs, because the purpose was to get married and have kids after they got off the ark and repopulate the Earth. So the interesting thing is, though, we find marine fossils all the way through the record, mixed in with the land creatures, which makes sense if the ocean waters flood the continents. I told you before about the chalk. The chalk beds have birds and dinosaurs buried in them with marine creatures. So there are mixtures. We get this common idea that you only get marine creatures in these layers, and higher up you only get land creatures. No, you don't. You get mixtures as you go up. And it's like, I like to give an illustration. If you get like a canyon like the Grand Canyon, at the top you got ponderosa pine and deer. At the bottom you got cacti and bighorn sheep. If the canyon got flooded and the creatures got buried, the ones at lower elevation would get buried first and be lower in the record, the ones at higher elevation, and that's exactly what we see in the fossil record. Now, here's an interesting thing. Often in the fossil record, we actually find the trails, the footprints and trails of the critter at layers at a lower level in the record before we find their bodily remains. So, for example, trilobites, we find their scurry marks that have been buried and fossilised and preserved. By the way, it had to be rapid. Otherwise, those scurry marks would get washed away. It had to be covered up quickly, and the trails held together by wet material that then got covered up quickly. And then in layers that are supposedly 10 or 15 million years later, we have the body fossils. I mean, how could those critters, it doesn't make sense. The critter who actually made the trail gets buried 10 to 15 million years later. And in some instances, you've got dinosaur footprints before you see the critter, and there's millions of years between the footprints of that dinosaur and the critter. It doesn't make sense, but in the flood it does, because you got days between the animals scurrying around and then it being buried in the floodwaters. Here's another interesting point. They talk about nests of fossil eggs. That must have been a long time. No, you've got to remember there was tides during the flood. A global ocean would have bigger tides. You'd also have the tsunamis, where the water level can go up by 100 feet and down by 100 feet or more. That means you'd have dinosaurs, say, swept away. Mother's about to lay eggs. She gets swept away. What does she do? She holds on to those eggs. The tide and the level drops. She finds herself stuck on a sandbank, unloads her eggs, and then she's swept away by the next current, and the water with sediment buries her eggs. They can have embryos in those eggs. She can hold on to those eggs for quite a while. The embryo could be developing, and so you could have them in the time that they're barely in hours on that sandbank, they hatch, and you get the hatchlings buried. And it's not millions of years, it's all very rapid. The other thing we notice is that, say, trilobites. We find no precursors to the trilobites in the layers below. They appear fully formed and fully functioning in the record. The trilobite is a complex creature. It has a compound eye that is so incredibly complex that we've only figured it out in the last decades as to how that operates. And yet it's been beautifully preserved in the fossil record. How did it get that incredible design, which requires an engineer, a designer, right from the start when it first appears in the record, and then it disappears because it gets wiped out? So it speaks of creation. God created things fully formed, fully functioning, that got destroyed during the flood, buried and covered. Now, of course, the layers aren't always in the correct sequence. In some places, you get earth movements that have overturned the layers, and the fossils will be in the wrong order. We need to remember the fossils are actually snapshots of buried life, not stages in the progression of life evolving from one thing into another. And so we find birds in the record, and we find dinosaurs in the record. If you want to connect them, that's a belief, because we don't see evidence of birds turning into dinosaurs. We don't see, in fact, it was Stephen Gould and some of his colleagues that said in the latter half of the 20th century that we don't see evidence of these transitional forms. They're missing. And so they proposed an idea that they suddenly evolved from one into the other without leaving any record. Now, we're not talking about slight differences in the size of a trilobite or the shape of a trilobite. That's trilobites breeding trilobites, or finches breeding finches with different sized beaks, or clams with different sized shells. They're still all clams. No, we're talking about transitions between body plans. We find scales and we find feathers. We don't find in between. And despite all the claims, Archaeopteryx is a true bird. Sure, it had claws on its wings and it had teeth in its bill, but we know of modern birds that have claws on their wings and teeth in their bills. We find, even if we found feathered dinosaurs, and there's claims that there are feathered dinosaurs, but are they designed for flight? Do we have all the mechanics for flight? The bird requires a specialised lung with a specialised respiratory system. There's a world of difference between the respiratory system of a dinosaur. I mean, dinosaurs might have had skin, they might have had scales, some might have even had feathers. Feathers might be there for beauty. God is a God of order and variety. He creates all the beautiful different flowers with all the different colours because he loves beauty and he loves variety. So why not create all sorts of different dinosaurs with different coverings? It doesn't mean that dinosaurs evolved into birds, not at all. It just means you've got dinosaurs that are different from birds. They can't fly, but they might have had feathers, they might have had scales, they might have had skin. Doesn't matter. They're all created, fully formed, fully functioning right from the beginning without any hint of ancestors that they evolved from and into.